and information. Her, she sent me a short biography of herself, and I'm just going to read from that because I think that it's nicely written. So she says, like many good stories, mine started with a road trip. At the age of 18, I came to Southern Arizona in a third-hand Chevy van with the dream of seeing a Gila monster in the wild. I fell in love with the desert and my spouse, and I stayed. My vocation has been working as a clinical microbiologist at the University Medical Center in Tucson. I'm now retired, but my avocation has been to document the plants, fungi, slime molds, and animals of the desert. I started with photographing wildflowers, and the occasional crab spider or green lynx spider would insinuate itself into the photos. Before I knew it, spiders and other arachnids had practically hijacked the photographic database, resulting in the publication of my book, Amazing Arachnids, published by Princeton University Press in 2018. And some of you will remember that Jillian gave us a program several years ago, maybe in 2018, with her arachnid photographs. My photographs have appeared in numerous other books and publications, and sometimes dreams really do come true. I have been lucky in not only seeing Gila monsters in the wild, but I can now say that some are my familiar friends and neighbors, as we share the same bit of desert to live in. I could not ask for more. So thank you, Jillian, for sending that, and also for the creative title of tonight's program. It's Elfin Saddles, Wolf's Milk and Witch's Butter, the fungi and slime molds of Southern Arizona. So this is sort of leading us into the Halloween season too.
Yeah, that's why I chose that.
Deserts are not usually thought of as home to fungi and slime molds, but a surprising number of species occur in Southern Arizona. The spores of these organisms bide their time, waiting for enough rain before making their brief but exciting appearance. Low elevation desert, medium elevation oak woodlands, and high elevation conifer forests each have their own array of species. True masters of survival, slime molds and fungi can survive the long, hot, desiccating droughts, which we know about that, fires on mountaintops, and cold of the snow line. The ephemeral appearance of these beautiful and fanciful organisms makes them all the more special to see. So we're going to be excited to have Jillian give us a tour of these organisms. And I do want to say, if you have questions for Jillian, please put them in the chat. And at the end of her presentation, we will take up those questions. So Jillian, thank you. And we're ready to hear all about it. Let
me go ahead and try to do the share screen thing then.
And let me just jump and ask all of our participants if you could please
Bill,
make.
Bill, can you help?
Can you hear me, Jillian?
Yeah, I can hear you right now. I'm trying to just open up this screen. Click on that.
While you're doing that, okay.
Oh, and then let's see. So slideshow. And okay.
Before you start, let me just ask everyone who's watching to please mute yourself if you're not giving the talk, because
Yes,
I hear your background noise.
To make this, Bill, is there some way to make this so that goes back to the first one? Oh wait, let me. Okay, and then to make this the biggest one. Oh, okay, great. It's showing all right. All right. So is everybody? Can you hear me? Okay.
Jillian, we're seeing the presentation mode, not the actual slideshow mode. So we're seeing your next slide as well as.
Uh-oh. Oh, really? Oh, dear. Because we're seeing, that's odd. It was supposed to show it as a slideshow.
Yeah, forward or back.
Yeah, let me try. Still not doing it, huh?
Still showing it as a 2-slide thing. Why don't you end the slideshow up at the top and try restarting it?
Yeah. Here, I'll click it on end slideshow. Let me try again. Click
Oh,
on
Slide.
maybe slideshow. It never loads quite the same from one time to the next.
Try going down to the bottom. Oops, go back where you were a minute ago, end slideshow.
Okay.
Go down to the bottom of this. Are you seeing a screen with a main slide and then all your little slides along the left?
Yep.
Okay, go down to the bottom to that slideshow, that button right you're at right now. Try.
Okay. Yeah, and it just shows that. That's very odd.
Page.
It should do it as a slideshow. I don't understand why it's not doing that.
Try ending it again and let's see.
No.
Because we're definitely seeing your screen, so we're going to get you anyway. So
Yeah, but it's annoying that it's not.
yeah, I know.
Let me try something else. Bill.
Okay.
Okay, let me try end slideshow. Let me try slideshow. And then that's strange. It doesn't let me do from the start either now. Huh. That's really weird. We might have to do it this way. It just doesn't seem to want to.
Well, you may just have to skip.
Settings, try display settings is a message from one person in the audience. Up at the top of that one, there's a show taskbar display settings.
Okay. Yeah. Swap presenter view and slide. Okay, let's try that. How's that? Is that better?
Yes, there it is.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, great. I'm telling you, every time it's a little different. Okay, so can you all hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep, okay. All right, so let's get rocking and rolling because this is a pretty long presentation. As you guys know, it's death by PowerPoint or abandon all hope, ye who enter here. Okay, Elfin Saddles, Wolf's Milk, and Witch's Butter, the fungi and slime molds of Southern Arizona. So first of all, what is a fungus and what is a slime mold? So fungi belong to their own kingdom fungi. We're going to talk about 2 of the phyla within that kingdom. There's actually like 8 phyla, depending on what system you use. We're going to look at phylum Basidiomycota and phylum Ascomycota, also known as sac fungi. The characteristics of fungi is that the cell wall is chitin. They're heterotrophic, which means that they don't do their own photosynthesis, and they're principally decomposers and many form partnerships with plants. This is in contrast with Phytophthora, also known as water molds, and the name Phytophthora means plant destroyer. And those are in the kingdom Heteroconta, which also includes giant kelp, by the way, phylum Oomycete, and they're fungus-like, but the cell wall is cellulose. And those are responsible for potato blight, among many other plant pathogens. So we're not going to talk about those other than the fact that they are not the same as fungi. And then the third kingdom that I want to mention is kingdom Protista, phylum Amoebozoa, which are the slime molds. And there's 3 different classes: Myxomycetes, which are plasmodial or acellular slime molds, where a single cell can have many nuclei because the nuclei divide, but the cell doesn't. So you can have tens of thousands of nuclei and a single giant cell that can weigh kilograms. Class Protostelia, which have a simple fruiting body stalk with spores. One species of slime mold that we're going to look at belongs to that. Most of them belong to the Myxomycetes. And then the third class is Dictostelia, which are actually social amoeba, also known as cellular slime molds, where they can live as individual amoeba or can aggregate into a slug or a grex. And then they form fruiting bodies. So that type we really won't be talking about. We're going to go from high elevation to low elevation, starting at the top of Mount Lemmon with conifer forest, a mixed conifer hardwood forest, down into the oak zone, and then down into the low desert. And in each situation, we'll look at Basidiomycetes, then Ascomycetes, and then slime molds. And at the very end, hopefully I can squeeze in ants, ergot, and mycelial networks very briefly. Okay, so let's start with something very typical. These are the amanitas up on the top of Mount Lemmon. They're big, they're conspicuous, they're obviously mushrooms. Everybody knows what a mushroom looks like. I want to point out that one of the ways that you can identify these things is a veil. A lot of the amanitas do have veils. However, I'd like to also mention at this point in time that I'm an amateur that is struggling to learn these fungi. And these identifications were done solely from my photographs, which is entirely improper. I should be looking at the microscopic morphology of spores and all sorts of other things. And so these are all presumptive IDs. Some of them are probably incorrect. So don't use my photos as a guide to identification. Please don't do that, because these are all presumptive IDs. They are not definitive. So a few other amanitas from up at the high elevation, and you can see how they change. This one is a nice mature one. This is one that's just coming up out of the ground. And they're very brightly colored and very beautiful. And you'll notice the veil on this one here, and that first one I showed. And other fungi also have veils. For example, this Lepiota, if you look under it, you can see this wispy sort of fibrous material here. That's what's left of the veil on this Lepiota. And some other fungi also have veils like that, but veils can also consist of a mucoid layer. So I'm not sure if this one happens to be the mucoid layer from an actual veil, but some fungi do have mucoid layers from veils. So I'm thinking that this Chromacera could be having a veil left from the mucoid layer. Uh-oh, what's happening here? It's not advancing. Let me try to, oh shoot, it's not advancing. I don't know what happened. Let me try using these arrows. Okay, I'll just use these arrows.
I just advanced.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm trying to show just some very interesting looking, a variety of fungi. This one is a waxy cap, Hygrocybe. And one thing to remember about these fungi is that all of these visible parts are just the fruiting body of the fungus. So the main part of the organism is usually not even visible. It's down under the ground or in the rotten log or whatever it is. That's all the mycelia. This part is just the sexual propagating part of the fungus and is expendable. So when you pick one of these things, don't feel too guilty, because the fungus isn't going to care. In fact, it wants those spores to be disseminated. So this is an oyster mushroom, and all this beautiful structure on these oyster mushrooms and all these other fungi are made up of hyphae. So that's one of the things that's sort of fun about them. This is Lentinellus species, and on first glance you might think it's a bract fungus, but then you realize that lo and behold, it has gills underneath. And we're going to see another Lentinellus from the low elevation desert, from 3,300 feet elevation, in fact, that is the analog to this. So you'll frequently see one species at high elevation and then a different species at lower elevation from the same genus. And it seems like a lot of times there are different distributions of species of these fungi, at least based on their elevation. So Lentinellus, one of the key characteristics is that you'll see that the gills are sort of serrated. They're sort of jagged looking. And that is one of the characteristics of this particular genus. Crepidotus is on a tree trunk, a rotten tree trunk. And you'll notice that these have virtually no stems. So if you're already up high on a tree trunk or up on a log, you don't need a stem to get up off the ground. So a lot of the ones that grow on tree trunks have very short stems or almost no stems, like these Crepidotus. Whereas the ones that come up out of the ground, like the Amanita, have a stem. That's to raise them up off the ground so that their spores can fall free from the gills and be disseminated by wind. So a lot of these little ones with short stems are up off the ground or on a rotten log or something like that. Xeroamphelina is a very, very abundant one up on Mount Lemon. If you look at rotten logs, you'll see aggregations of these things, large numbers of them. And it's probably one of the most common species up there. This one also forms big clusters, Foliota, and this particular species is very popular with pleasing fungus beetles. So you can see pleasing fungus beetles, adults and larvae, feeding on this cluster of Foliota. Inky caps. Okay, so inky caps are found at all different elevations. But up on the top of Mount Lemon, here was a nice little cluster of inky caps. And you can see why they're called inky caps, because as the caps get old, they literally liquefy and you get this viscous black fluid dripping down from them. That's probably loaded with spores. This particular little one, Baeospora, is a really neat one. This is a conifer cone. And you can see this cone has some little mushrooms popping out from between the scales of the conifer cone. So the entire mycelia, the entire organism of this particular mushroom is growing within that one conifer cone. And these little mushrooms are popping out. Another one that's associated with conifer cones and grows on rotten ones that are usually semi-buried is Oroscalpium vulgare. This is also known as the ear pick fungus. And you can notice that this shape of this top of the fungus looks a little bit like an ear. And then if you look at the underside, it's all teeth. And so this particular fungus, I think that that's where the name ear pick comes from, because of the shape of the ear and then the little teeth. But the strategy of having teeth or gills basically increases the surface area from which spores can be produced. And then the spores are on these vertical surfaces, either these teeth hanging down or gills, or in some cases pores, and they'll just passively fall free and drift away in the wind. So sometimes these earpick fungi are black. And you can see this conifer cone right to the right, a little part of it. So these were growing out of this conifer cone. So the corticoid fungi, bracts and polypores are another group. And this one is called a rosy conch. It's a young one, small and rather beautiful, beautiful pink rosy color. And once again, these pores open out facing to the ground, but it's up on a tree trunk or a rotten log. And so the spores will fall free and drift away in the wind. As that rosy conch gets older, it's not nearly as pretty. And here's one that's growing in a very atypical presentation, but I'm pretty sure it's still rosy conch. It has what's called guttation. So if it's fungi are growing in a really, really moist area, they'll extrude extra moisture. And a lot of times that's colored in very beautiful colors as these clear drops come out. And also, in addition to that, you can see some really neat little columbella that are feasting on this fungus. There's the pores to this rosy conch. many of these bract type fungi can break down not only cellulose, which is fairly easy to break down, but also lignin in the wood. So not very many organisms can break down lignin. It's a hard molecule to break apart, but a lot of these ones can. And some of them have beautiful structures. So this one's called a Dyer's bract, I believe, or something like that, but it's got a very characteristic look to it. And you see these up on the top of Mount Lemon. This is Sterium hirsutum. So this is a corticoid fungus that forms a bract. And you'll notice it's kind of hairy looking. Well, there's another species of Sterium that you're going to see an analogous one, an analog to this, that grows down in mid-elevation areas, oak forest, called Sterium complicatum. I'll show you that later. Trichaptum is pretty neat. These grow on conifer trees, and you'll see large numbers of these bracts all kind of stacked up like plates. From the top, they don't look very exciting, but if you stand under them and take a gander up there, they look like plates of amethyst crystals. They actually have kind of a little sparkle, and they look just like the amethyst from Brazil. They're just this deep, beautiful amethyst purple.
Huh.
And then you have other corticoid fungi like this Piniophora. So Piniophora is a genus of corticoid fungus that serves as a host to a parasitic fungus called witch's butter. And we'll see the witch's butter a little later, but just remember, witch's butter feeds on Piniophora fungi. And then you have ones like Phlebiopsis, which is another sort of corticoid fungus that grows on the surface of dead logs and such. This one looks like ice crystals. And these are like a centimeter across. They're pretty good size. Now for some jellies, we're still in the Basidiomycetes. I wanted to mention that we started with Basidiomycetes and we're still working on those. So this is Dacromyces and Guepina or Guepinia, I guess this is. These jellies always have the most beautiful sculptural qualities to them. This kind of little jelly is quite tiny. It's only less than a centimeter across. It's probably only about like 5 millimeters across, each of these little jellies. You can have black jellies like Exidia glandulosa. Looks a little bit warty. And white jellies like Pseudohydnum gelatinosum. So this is a young Pseudohydnum. And as they get bigger, they look like this. And they're a few centimeters across. And these ones, once again, have teeth on the underside, which increases the surface area from which spores can be released. You can see the size because there's moss growing on this, which gives you a little bit of scale. This is a really neat one, this Calicera viscosa, because it's a jelly, but it has convergent evolution for the structure as Ramaria, which is a coral fungus. So Ramaria has almost identical structure as that little Calicera. And these coral fungi can also be a little more stout or even more stout, like this little one.
How cute is that?
And we're still doing Basidiomycota right now, okay? Clavulina could be mistaken for Ramaria, but it's got a more clavate type of structure to it. These are some cephaloid fungi. These are called Calyptella capula. And I love these because they look just like little bells on dead wood. And each of these is only a few millimeters in length. Another cephaloid one that looks a lot like Calyptella is Rhymbacia, but Rhymbacia is parasitic on moss. So it's got a little bit different lifestyle, but it's another cephaloid fungus. These little Henningsomyces candidus are extremely tiny. You would not be able to see them with your naked eye to this degree at all. They're about 2 millimeters across, or maybe even smaller. You really get eye strain trying to see these little things, but they're on the undersides of rotten wood. So when you see white stuff on the underside of rotten wood, take a closer look with a loop. I highly recommend bringing a loop and an extra LED light with you when you go out looking at rotten logs. Mucronella is one of the cool little ones that I see on rotten wood up on Mount Lemmon quite frequently. And this cluster of them was growing on the underside of a dead conch. It was probably a rosy conch that had died, and it was being recycled by yet another fungus. So the rosy conch had been living on a dead tree log, and in turn, when it died, it was being recycled by these other fungi. And it looked almost like a little forest of them. They're only a few millimeters long, these little teeth. Bird's nest fungi are kind of neat because they have specialized structures. The nest is called a peridia, and the little eggs are called peridioles. And the peridioles are holding the spores. And what happens is that if a drop of rainwater hits in that nest, it sort of splashes the little eggs out. So it's still dispersion that is not active. Now we're going to get into ascomycetes from high elevation. This is Peltagira, which is a lichen. So lichens have a very interesting life cycle. They're actually a composite organism composed of at least one fungus and at least one algae or cyanobacteria. So the algae needs to partner with at least one photobiont, something that can photosynthesize. And frequently there's actually more than 2 partners involved. There could be quite a few partners. In fact, they found out that lichens are very complicated. This one's called the dogtooth lichen. And you can see why. These are showing some of those reproductive structures for the lichen. And lichens are named for the fungus part of the partnership. They don't try to name them, including the algae and all the other things. So they're named after the fungus. Some other ascomycetes from the high elevation. And by the way, ascomycete refers to asci, or little sacs that produce the spores, and then the spores are actively catapulted out of these little microscopic sacs. But anyway, it's differences on how the spore structures are stored and released. So here's an ascomycete, a spathularia. Here's your elfin saddle, yay, a white elfin saddle that's a little chewed up looking. So here's one that's just freshly emerged and that the snails and slugs haven't eaten it yet. And you'll see another one later on. So that's the white elfin saddle that's called Helvella crispa. And here's Helvella vespertina, the black elfin saddle. And then here's Helvella macropus, which is a black felt cup. So a lot of the ascomycetes are shaped more or less like cups. And that's because they have a way of actively catapulting their spores out. So they don't have to hang with gills hanging down over the ground or something like that. They can actually kind of shoot their little spores out. And here's a more mature one. You can see the moss next to it for scale. These are called Scutellinia scutellata. These are eyelash cup fungi. And they're called eyelash cup fungi for obvious reasons. They look like they have little eyelashes around them. So ascomycetes have a lot of cup fungi, like a Acervus. Here's another one. Humeria hemispherica is a cool one. This one was only a few millimeters across on some rotten wood and looked almost like a little sphere, a little hollow sphere. But when they mature, they look like this. And the spores would be produced from somewhere on that whole white surface, and they're sort of catapulted out when they're ripe. This is Orbilia, possibly, another little cup fungus that's an ascomycete. Calycina or Bispirilla citrina. Now, a lot of people still call them Bispirilla, but some of the newer publications call it Calycina. You'll find that fungi have lots and lots of names. And these are only about maybe 4 or 5 millimeters in diameter. Each of these are quite tiny, but they're very abundant and very bright. And so they're pretty easy to find. This Lachnelula calicoformis, these are tiny little cup fungi on a stick that was lying on the ground and growing them. And these are probably only about 3 millimeters in diameter, each of these, tiny. And these Lachnum virginium are even smaller. These things really require a hand lens to see, unless you take photos and then really blow them up. But these ones I think are showing some guttation where they're expelling the extra fluid out. Molesia is a very common little gray cup fungus, once again, very small. And this one's really tiny. I'm not sure about the identification of this. There's a couple possibilities, which I wrote down on the slide. But for size, this was like a maple leaf or some other hardwood tree that had dropped its leaves and the leaf was already mostly decomposed. And these particular fungi grow on the vein of that leaf. So that gives you kind of an idea how small they are. And all their hyphae and everything is contained somewhere in those veins of the leaf. These Rosalinea, also you need a hand lens for, but they look like little blueberries. And once again, a lot of these ascomycetes are very small. This Ascocurin is a really nice one. This one is I would say between 5 and maybe even as much as 10 millimeters in diameter. So this is a pretty big ascomycete. And when I was photographing these, I realized I had 3 for 1. I had the Ascocurin, but you also see tiny little orange balls there and little black structures. And those are all different ascomycetes. So the small orange ones are Nectraceae. It's really difficult to get them more specific than that from a photo. And then the little black ones, I am guessing might be Eutypa, but that's really a guess. So in rotten wood, if you look closely, you can see a lot of neat stuff. In fact, many a time I'd get a photo home of some fungus that photographed and realize that there was stuff that I wasn't even aware of. These little Nectraceae, I think, are like little hollow balls, and these literally required a hand lens to see. These were probably no more than 1 millimeter across, maybe even less. Okay, for slime molds in the high elevation, Arceria denudata. So these are all sporulating, that's why they look kind of fluffy. Arceria obvellata. This is Ceratia mixa fruticulosa variety arbuscula, and that's quite a mouthful. This is the one species that is not a Myxogastria that I'm showing among our slime molds. This one belongs to that second class, Protostelia. And you can see why they call them variety arbuscula, because they look a little bit like bushes or maybe trees. If you use a lot of imagination, a few of them in this shot look almost like maybe baobab trees or something with a big fat trunk. They start out looking very glassy and then get this powdery white look as they sporulate. So that little fuzzy stuff on them, those are the little structures that actually have spores. But these little branches are only about 2 millimeters tall. So they're really small. But this slide shows some stages of life on them, life stages where there's some that are almost clear in color like glass, and then some that are more opaque that are sporulating. this species also comes in yellow. So supposedly it's still the same species, but yellow. And here's a close-up showing them sporulating, those same yellow ones, a few days later, looking all fuzzy because they're sporulating. Now that same species has a whole different form called variety poroides. And these poroides ones, I guess, are because they look like they have pores, almost like a big sponge. But these are very beautiful structures. And they're actually pretty sizable. I mean, some of them are a good centimeter across. And some of them look like glass sculptures to me. They're so beautiful. Okay, this is Cribaria cancellata. So this is a little Mixogastria, one of the slime molds that's from the main group of slime molds that we'll be looking at. And you can see these things form almost like a little hollow wire basket. And it looks like lines of longitude there, but they release all their spores out there and then leave this little hollow basket. Didymium nigripes. These ones love dead leaves. And so up there on Mount Lemmon, after the summer rains have been going really well, if you go up there and look at the rotten leaves lying on the ground, you'll see these didymiums, sometimes massive amounts of them clustered on these leaves. And notice how they distribute themselves very beautifully on here. This particular slime mold is very, very tiny. You really need a hand lens to see this thing. And Erythanema papillatum, I think is how you would say that. And they look like they're looking around in all different directions. But these brown fuzzy ones are sporulating already. But I think that this one in this photo at the left where you see it sort of shiny and black, I think it's a younger one that hasn't sporulated yet. The famous wolf's milk. Okay, so one of the things in the title of the talk was wolf's milk. So here's Lycogala epidendrum, famous wolf's milk, and these things can be, oh gosh, between 5 and 10 millimeters in diameter. Some of them are pretty close to a centimeter, or yeah, pretty close to that, maybe a little less. But you can see that there's a collembola feeding on the plasmodium here, and one that's oozing out some of its little guts. And apparently if you were to squeeze one of these, it would squirt out, and people do that. But that's somehow how they got the name wolf's milk, is because they have this sort of liquid inside that you can squirt out. When they start out, they look like this, kind of beautiful texture and color. And then as they mature, they look more like this. Metatrichia floriformis. I think it's self-evident why they're called floriformis, because they look like little clusters of flowers. And these were just in a huge, huge number on one piece of really soggy, rotten wood up there. You can see some in here that are kind of damaged, and you can see some of the spores in there. And by the way, my photos are nothing compared to people that do focus stacking. The people that focus stack can do much, much better than I do. My photos are pretty crappy compared to theirs, but it takes forever to do those focus stackings. And I like to photograph lots of stuff. Physarum citrinum. So this was on some rotten wood. And once again, I want to reiterate that my identifications are presumptive. They're not definitive. So to get a definitive ID on this one, you would need to look at the spores, the microscopic structures of the spores. This one, Reticularia splendens. I think that that's a misnomer. It doesn't look very splendid to me, but to those collembola it probably does, because they're feeding on it. Stemonitis starts out looking like this. And after a short while, it looks like this, chocolate fingers. That's what people commonly call this, is chocolate fingers. Then after all the spores are released, they look like little feathers. Stem on Nitopsis species. Okay, so this was photographed one afternoon. And if you notice the little runty one there to the left of center, you'll see the exact same cluster taken the next morning. So that's how much they change over a few hours. So in hours, or even, I've seen them change color even in 1 hour. So you really have to be in the right place at the right time to get these photos. Trichia decipiens. So these can form massive amounts on rotten logs, like several inches across, these aggregations of these gorgeous little orange slime molds. And Trichia varia. The reason why I think that these are called Trichia varia is because they start out white like this, forming really beautiful arrangements on some dead wood. And then the next day they might be yellow, a pale yellow like this. And a little later, they turn a deeper yellow. And then a really nice deep gold. And then the next day, there'll be a burnished brown, almost like a hematite burnished to them. And finally, when they're sort of done, guess what? There's a little ascomycete fungus which will parasitize them. Those little white things sticking out are some little fungi. Now, I want to talk very briefly about the burn area up on Mount Lemmon. This was from where the Bighorn Fire swept across the top of Mount Lemmon. And the Meadow Loop Trail, you get these beautiful views, including these snags of dead stuff. And it's really coming back nice. I mean, there's just all kinds of wildflowers up there this past summer. But in addition to wildflowers, there were literally thousands of these little Geopixus carbonaria, which are fungi that love carbon. So the charcoal is what they're growing on. And there were literally thousands. So with the misfortune of those trees, that was the lucky event for these little fungi. You can see that they have little stems on them and the little cups. So they're typical ascomycetes. And to the right of this cluster of the little Geopixus, you'll see a little purple fungus, and that's a little purple Pizziza. And it might be one of two different species that both are known to grow on charcoal. There's a more mature one, actually a couple of them right there. And then this pulvinula is kind of a neat little thing, forming these little ruffles. You can see above the pulvinula, there's a couple of Geopixus that are sort of falling apart. But these little things are tiny. They're about, I would estimate, about 4 millimeters in diameter. But they love that charcoal. And some others that love charcoal is Anthracobia. These look almost like tiles to a mosaic, the way that they arrange themselves. Mixomphalia. Our old friend Phaeolus schwentzii, which you saw a little earlier. Lacaria lacata. This is also known as the deceiver. Theliophora terrestris. This looks like a bract fungus, but it's not. It has a fuzz underside, and you can see how it's kind of engulfing and growing in among the charcoal from a burn area. And then also up there in the burn area, there was a fallen tree that had been burnt and it was dead. And from death came this beautiful slime mold, Trichia decipiens. Gorgeous orange on the black, which I thought was perfect for October, Halloween. Okay, middle elevation. Let's start with the Basidiomycetes. And so some of the common ones that you'll see that are conspicuous, that are analogous to the Amanitas, would be the Boletes type of fungi with the fat stems and the pores underneath. So once again, the pores give you more surface area where spores can passively drop from those pores and fall and be drifting along on the wind. And other ones like Russula have gills, same idea. There's vertical surfaces that from which that provide greater surface area for spore production, and yet the stem lifts it up off the ground and the spores can fly free. So a lot of times they're very colorful, these big ones. And one of the biggest ones is Cantharellus californicus, which can actually, this thing was bigger than my hat, a really big fungus. One of the ones I think is very interesting is Omphallotus illudens. So this is, the scientific name illudens is in reference to the fact that this thing can bioluminesce in the dark. It can glow green in the dark. So that's kind of neat. Scaly caps and rust gills. So this one, you can see why it's called a scaly cap, and this cluster was coming out of a dead sycamore tree in Ramsey Canyon. The tree was long dead and weathered and silvery, and it had this beautiful wood grain, and these things looked like they were just sort of floating on the wood grain. It was really amazing. The sculptural appearance of fungi is something I just constantly am amazed by. Hygrocybe, so here's a waxy cap and another waxy cap. Lactarius. So these Lactarius, you can see that there's a little animal to the right there with its little long legs sticking out. That's probably a Linopodes mite. And Linopodes like to feed on fungi. And I saw lots and lots of these up at Ramsey Canyon, which is where these Lactarius were. You can tell that these are oak leaves in these photos. So we're at middle elevation. Strobilomyces, old man of the woods, this is called. This Bulbitius titibans is a really neat one because it looks like a little parasol mushroom when it's mature, but when it's smaller, the one on the right is the same species and it has all this kind of mucoid look to it. So they're very easy to identify with the two of them together like that. And Hemimycena. So some fungi are quite tiny and very elegant. You'll notice that the stem on this Hemimycena is very delicate looking, and these are indeed very delicate. They'll dry up very easily. In contrast to these Marasmias. Marasmias have kind of wiry, tough little stems. And this one is very easy to identify because it has a deep little pit in the middle, and on the underside, there's a little collar. So this particular species is very easy to identify, even from just photographs. Resipinatus. This Resipinatus is only about 1 centimeter tall. And these are really beautiful sculptures. I just can't get over how beautiful they can look when they're arranged or even a single one like I had just shown. These were growing under a rotten log in Madeira Canyon. So Madeira Canyon, Garden Canyon, Ramsey Canyon are all excellent places to look for these middle elevation fungi. This one here, this is a tentative identification, Hohenbehelia ungicularis rather. And I think that the ungicularis is in reference to the fact that they look like little hooves. These are small, no more than 1 centimeter across on each one. Crepidotus mollis. This is also called the peeling Crepidotus. This is growing near the base of a tree. And this one, Crepidotus cinnabarinus, is my white whale because I photographed these. These were among the very first fungi that I ever photographed more than 10 years ago. And at the time, I didn't know what they were, but if I had realized that when they were mature, they would be even more spectacular, I would have killed to get back there and get them when they were mature. I've never found these since then. They're very rare to find. They were only a few millimeters across when I got these, and they were immature. But they're spectacularly pretty. This one, Neophavelus alveolaris, from the top doesn't look very exciting, but when you look at the underside, it's pretty interesting. You can see where the alveolaris is the same root from which the alveoli of your lungs, that same meaning of these little pockets. Ceroporia tarda. This is one of the polypores or crust type fungi. This was growing on the underside of some rotten wood lying on the ground in Madeira Canyon, and the colors were just spectacular. You can see why they're called polypores. So sometimes these crusts will be growing on the undersides of things. Ganoderma lobatum. So when this thing is young, it looks like a heap of whipped cream or shaving cream that was squirted out on a tree trunk. But as it gets older, it develops some brown color. And a couple days later, it looked like this. So these things change dramatically over a few days. Trametes versicolor. This is the famous turkey tail, which is a corticoid fungus. And sometimes you see photos of these from other parts of the country, at least, where they actually have some blue in there. And I wish I could see that. Here's the analog to the Sterium hirsutum that you saw up on the top of Mount Lemmon. This is Sterium complicatum, growing down on oaks. And a corticoid fungus, Phlebiopsis, beautiful deep purple velvet. This one is a guess on this ID. I think it's Leticeria agaves, but I'm not 100% sure of that by any stretch because I've never found a photo of that particular species. But there's a similar species that grows on grasses that has that same coral red color. Auricularia americana. So this one's called the wood ear, and you can see why it's called the wood ear because right in the middle of this formation, you can see something that looks a lot like a human ear, and it's growing out of wood. So I guess it makes perfect sense to call it a wood ear. This is a jelly, and sometimes they look a little less convincing like an ear. These are sort of like malformed ears, I guess. Now this Phaeotramella frondosa looks a lot like the wood ear, but a little more ruffled. This is actually a parasitic fungus, and it parasitizes the Sterium that you saw before. So it parasitizes that corticoid bract fungus. And here's witch's butter, Tremella mesenterica, which is a jelly that parasitizes the Piniophora that I showed earlier. And here's one more little jelly that's shaped like a spatula. So the spatularium must refer to that. And if there's one thing that I associate with those middle elevations is loads and loads of bird's nests and earth stars. So bird's nests and earth stars were both put in a category called gastroid fungi, which included puffballs, stinkhorns, and bird's nests and earth stars. And so this one shows a mature one right next to an immature one that still has a little lid. And these were growing in the same area as the Cyathus striatus, a different species of bird's nest fungus. Once again, I have a mature one and an immature one that still has its lid. And these were all found together in vast numbers in Ramsey Canyon last summer. You could find just loads of these things in some spots. right within, literally right next to the trails. So you didn't have to step off the trail or anything to get a photo like this. Earth stars are sort of interesting because they actually belong to two completely unrelated groups that have convergently evolved to look very much the same. Astrius belongs to one group, and Geastrum belongs to the other group. They're not related, but they look a lot alike. So we have several kinds of Geastrum in our area, these Earth stars. And one of them is called Geastrum pectinatum, and it has a neck with a little head and then a little beak sticking out. So this was up in Madeira Canyon. The puffballs are very abundant at middle elevations. And when I say abundant, I really mean that. Sometimes you can see groups of like 50 or more of them clustered together in an ideal area. This is a puffball that I find very interesting. This is Pisolithus, and it's called the dyer's puffball. And the reason why it's called the dyer's puffball is that apparently people used to use it to dye fabrics because it has this nasty, slimy, dark liquid in it if you try to handle it. But the reason why I think it's interesting is that you notice that this mature one has kind of a pebbly texture to the surface. And apparently the spores are in these little compartments. And so that's a little different than most puffballs. And if you were to take a sharp knife and cut it in cross section, you could probably see really neat texture of all those little compartments in cross section. Lots and lots of ramaria up there in those middle elevations. You can see the oak leaves lying around. That gives you some scale. And here's the analog to that Peltagyra that you saw earlier, that dog's tooth lichen. Here's a Peltagyra with much smaller teeth, a different species at a little bit lower elevation. And once again, these are composite organisms made up of a fungus and either at least one algae or cyanobacteria. All right, here's a white elfin saddle again. This is growing at middle elevation. So now we're in the ascomycetes. And you can see this one actually looks a little bit like a saddle. So you can see why they would call it an elfin saddle.
So cool.
Pazizas, so various cup fungi. Once again, these ascomycetes form these little cups because they can catapult their spores. And Rossolinia again. And here's a really neat one, little Pseudopithiella. And it's Pseudopithiella minuscula. And they were all very nice, kind of roundish objects that I don't know if these were rotting juniper berries or some other substance that they were using for their substrate. But you can see that they're quite small, but very brightly colored. So you could actually spot them from quite a distance off. Hyal orbilia. So these are a lot like the orbilia that you saw earlier. And then for slime molds from middle elevations, I want to show this slide because this is a little fragment of wood that was about an inch across, maybe an inch by an inch by an inch, that I brought home from Molino Basin. It was a little piece lying on the ground that was punky and rotten. And I soaked it in water for a couple days and then put it in a moist chamber. And lo and behold, up sprouted some slime molds. So this is one way that you can look at things at home, is to bring home a little bit of dead vegetation and soak it and then put it in a moist chamber. And you can see the plasmodia stage, which look like just blobs, and also the fruiting bodies. So these Arceria turned out really nice, these homegrown ones, but from Molino Basin. Here's some from Ramsey Canyon, same species, but they, in this case, they formed these beautiful little bush-like clusters. And my eyes really popped out when I saw these. They were so beautiful, but they're quite tiny. These are still only a few millimeters in height. And they look huge though in comparison to that little Linopodes mite that's down there, sort of standing there with its front legs sticking up. Hemitrichia caliculata, a couple of them sort of snuggling up together. Metatrichia vesperum. So these ones, the name vesperum refers to them being like a little wasp nest. And you can see why, because in the upper left corner, there's some that had already released their spores and they look more or less like a little wasp, empty wasp nest. Tubifera, that's a famous one. This particular clump was well over 1 centimeter in length. So it was very easy to spot with the naked eye. And sometimes they'll be bright pink tubiferas. Here's the famous dog vomit slime mold. So everybody gets to see dog vomit now and then. And this is the stage where it's crawling around and still engulfing stuff and feeding on things. And in Scandinavia, allegedly, one of the terms for this is troll cat vomit, which I think would make a great name for a rock and roll band, frankly. Troll cat vomit, yeah. I mean, isn't that great? And as these things get older, they look like this when they're sporulating. And in Scandinavia, apparently they call this also witch's butter. So this is the second organism that sometimes is called witch's butter, somewhere around the world at least. Okay, low elevation. We'll start with the basidiomycetes, Coprinopsis. The inky caps seem to be very abundant in low elevation, and I never ever saw jelly at low elevation. So there is a definite switch over when you get to the low elevation. Maybe it's just too darn dry for jellies. But inky caps seem to do pretty well, even though they're pretty fragile. So this particular little Coprinopsis, I don't know the species of, but I was finding this in a mesquite bosque at 3,300 feet elevation, right where there's saguaro and mesquite and that general type of stuff, and low hot desert. And it was growing on a decomposing leaf of a hackberry or something else that was there in the mesquite bosque. There was actually passion flower vines there, so who knows, it may have been an old passion flower leaf. And this thing was only about 4 millimeters long. You can see some slime molds, 2 kinds of slime molds also growing on that leaf. So I brought home this little fragment of rotten leaf with its mushroom, and by about 9 o'clock at night, it had grown some. And by 1 o'clock in the morning, I actually had to get up during the night to photograph it. So by 1 o'clock in the morning, it looked like that. By 5 in the morning, it looked like this. And by 6 in the morning, even though I was popping it right away back in the chamber right after photographing it, it was already going by. So even if you popped out to the mesquite bosque at 6 in the morning, these things were already starting to just wither. So my point is that sometimes these things, it's the only way you're going to see them is if you bring them home and let them grow on the tiny ones like that. This one's called a magpie inky cap, I guess because of the dark and white markings on it. These are parasol inky caps. Beautiful little things. I just went crazy when I was photographing these. Marasmius. So I found 3 different species of Marasmius in one little section of mesquite bosque. And as I mentioned, Marasmius have tougher little stems, so maybe that's why they do well there. There's a seedling mesquite that's dwarfing these, so that will give you some idea of scale. The underside of this species looks like this. I think that this might be Marasmius gramenum. And when they're old, they kind of look like little pinwheels. Here's another species I found there that might be Marasmius siccus. And the third one, I'm sure of the ID on this one, Marasmius hematocephalus. So these little red caps were there in literally the hundreds in this one mesquite bosque. And they have wiry little crooked stems. The stems sometimes are bent in all different directions, and they're wiry and tough. Saproamanita I found at the low elevation. I never found any of the pretty amanitas, just this kind of gnarly looking thing. And Arenia, this could be Arenia or Omphalina. Very difficult to get species on these low elevation stuff, just from photos anyway. And these look like champagne flutes, but they grow along paths where it's soil, and then there's also moss growing. So I don't know if they require the moss or not. I did find a different species of bird's nest at low elevation, Cyathus ola. And Cyathus stercoreus is found all over the place. They're pretty ubiquitous, but they're usually in association with manure. So this was actually in a pot where there's a plant growing, but I have also seen them where very old cattle manure has been sitting out and it's decomposing, and these things will be growing on it. Geastrum. So this beautiful, dainty little geastrum was in our low elevation mesquite bosque. And I had no idea that these things existed in there. This is a really neat one, Lentinus argillarius. So it starts out with a really tall stem in relation to a very small cap. And then if you wait a few days, the cap has grown into the stem. So it sort of like waits for like the feet of a puppy will be really big and the dog will grow into it. Well, it's kind of like this. But if you look at the underside of that Lentinus, it's a really beautiful, beautiful network of pores. This one is Panis of some sort. Now, Panis usually are lavender, and this thing's kind of a pinkish color, and then it turns a tan. And the tan Panis are supposed to be really big, but this one was only about 1 inch across, so I have no idea what species it is. But it's a low elevation desert Panis. That's the only thing I can tell you. We do have stinkhorns in our low desert. So these were really interesting because you could smell them long before you came up to the fungus. And stinkhorns disseminate their spores by attracting flies to them because they smell so odoriferous. And when they're mature, they get this oozy-like stuff coming out, and the flies apparently love that. And that's full of spores. Lentinellus ursinus. So early on, very early up on Mount Lemmon, you saw one Lentinellus. And here's another one that's named for a bear Lentinellus, and it's fuzzy on top, very different from the other one. It's got the jagged gills on the underside, so this is an underside shot. So the serrated gills are characteristic of Lentinus. And then the cool thing is that the older ones look almost like little bear paws with toes. I mean, these are so, I kept thinking these look like little paws. And then when I found out it's very likely Lentinus ursinus, it was kind of like, oh yeah, that makes sense. This is one of my favorites, Schizo Island commune. So this is a really tough little gilled fungus that apparently can dry up almost completely. And then when there's rain, it just kind of rehydrates and gets going again, takes up where it left off and forms these beautiful structures. So it's like, oh, it reminds me of that resurrection plant. And sometimes you can see guttation. This one's a neat one, Daldina concentrica. So this one is, the common name for it is King Alfred's cake. And if you look up history about King Alfred was the English king who held a portion of England from Vikings being able to take it over, like back in the 800s, I believe it was. Well, at one point, things were not going well for him against the Vikings. And it was just a tiny band of him and a few soldiers. And they were trying to run away from the Vikings and hide from them until they could regroup and regain their strength. And he went to a farmer's house, and the farmer's wife asked him to watch the cakes as they were cooking on the hearth. And apparently he got sidetracked thinking about all his problems, and he let the cakes burn. And allegedly, this little fungus looks like a burnt cake, which kind of makes me wonder what the heck kind of cake they used to eat. But anyway, it's called King Alfred's cake. And if you were to cut it in cross section, you see these interesting structures. First of all, you can see where the concentrica comes from. But the other thing you can see are these neat little pockets. So those little pockets are where I believe the spores are formed, and then they probably form a little sinus tract to the surface and release the spores. You can see a collembola there photobombing this photo. Nectraceae look like just some dried blood or something on the rotten bark of this fallen tree. But if you look closely at them, they're pretty cool. These little Nectraceae, though, you need a hand loupe or something to see them like that. This was at 5x magnification that I photoed these, and it's a crop of that. So they were really, really tiny. Also among the ascomycetes are some lichens, so low-level lichens. There are many, many lichens in the low desert, but these soras are among the few that we could get identified easily. So Sora crenata, and here's Pseudorussellii. And guess what? When we get to the slime molds, there's our familiar wolf's milk and our Ceria cinerea and our Ceria denudata. There was also dog vomit and several others that I've seen at higher elevations. So what that brings out is that these slime molds are very good at living at all different elevations, all different climates, and they are indeed cosmopolitan around the globe. You'll find the same species all over the globe. Comatrica nigra. And producing spores, I think, is one of the reasons why they're pretty robust. So they can withstand long periods of drought. Now, these slime molds that I photographed and fungi that I photographed this past summer, of which a great many of these photos were ones that I photographed this last summer, those had survived the previous 18 months in which we had only 2 inches of rain total in 18 months in the low desert. So they survived some pretty tough conditions. This is to show scale. They're pretty small. Craterium leucocephalum. This was in the low mesquite bosque on some petioles and twigs. And then once they start sporulating, you can see that the coating kind of peels back, and that's useful for identification. Diderma hemisphericum. This is one that's rather rarely photographed, so I was actually very lucky to see this. You can see they're literally as cute as little buttons.
Oh, Jillian,
Yes.
excuse me, but if we're gonna have time for questions.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I'll hurry up. We're getting very close to the end.
Okay.
Okay, so Didymium squamulosum, Physarum globuliferum, and finally, I just want to talk very, very briefly about their ecological role of fungi and slime molds. First of all, they serve as a food source for a great many animals, such as slugs, snails, these Linopodes mites, tube-tailed thrips, so these are insects, pleasing fungus beetles, which can aggregate in great numbers on them, collembola. These little polka dot collembola were really cute, only about 1 millimeter in size. And a special relationship of fungi with insects is with the leaf-cutting ants. So these leaf-cutting ants collect leaves and flowers in the low desert. They put them out to dry a little bit outside of their burrow. Then they carry them down and they make paper mache out of those leaves and flowers. And they plant fungi on those paper mache, and then they harvest the fungi that they grow. The queen leafcutter ant, right after mating, this is the only glance you'll get of her right after she's mated, is that she'll be digging out a burrow the very next morning. Then she'll seal herself in that burrow. She'll remove a little culture of the fungus that she carries in a pocket in her mouth. And she'll lay a trophic egg or two and plant the fungus on that trophic egg, fertilize it by defecating on it. And then when her daughters grow up, they'll go and cut leaves and flowers to grow. But the fungi are associated with these leafcutter ants. They've been farming for about 6 million years that make our 10,000 years sound like nothing. In tanglehead grass, an ergot induces the grass to produce these sticky, sweet substance, which is thick. You can see bubbles trapped. And many insects will nectar on that sticky, sweet substance, including butterflies, lacewings, beetles, and they'll disperse the spores of the ergot as they go from plant to plant. So the ergot is employing the insects and the grass for its own reproduction. Even flies disperse it. And finally, I want to just say for mycorrhizal networks that the Coleorrhiza striata are coral root orchids, and these pine drops that belong in the Ericaceae family are sort of flags for the presence of mycorrhizal networks that are underground. These are parasitic on the mycorrhizal networks, but those networks connect different plants, different trees, and so they can move nutrients from one tree to another, even from one species of tree to another via these mycorrhizal networks. So one of the things that you can think about for slime molds is that they're self-organizing. They can make decisions without a brain. They can even run simple mazes. For fungi, the real characteristic of them is that they form networks, including partnerships with other organisms. The partnership can simultaneously involve several partners, and the networks of mycelia can connect different plants, including different species of plants, and can move resources from one plant to another. So the takeaway lesson is that life is complicated and entangled, and life is beautiful. That's it. And share. Oh, I don't see a and share.
Gosh, that's just.
Stop share. There we are. Okay.
Thank you. That is so amazing. It takes my breath away.
Yeah, well, it's a whole kingdom. And actually, when you think about the amoebas are another whole kingdom. And none of them are plants, which seems ironic to talk about it to the Native Plant Society, but traditionally they are kept in herbaria. So I think it's okay.
And they're with the plants.
Yep. And they all used to be actually classified as plants back a long, long time ago when we thought that there were only two kingdoms, animals and plants. And now we've added a lot of kingdoms because we realize that life is not so simple as just two. So, yeah. Yeah,
and actually one of the questions that came up early when you were talking about lichens, they can't have exactly the same name as the fungus, can they? And how is nomenclature affected if more than one fungus is present?
Okay, so usually I believe it's just one fungus, but it can be more than one, either green algae and or a cyanobacteria involved. And sometimes there's a bacteria involved also. So there's a guy that there's a book called Entangled Life that I read recently, in which the guy talked about that someone who was doing DNA on lichens discovered that there's really almost never only two partners in the lichen. There's usually more than two. So they name it after the fungus. There's usually just one fungus, but there's usually more than one other partner involved with that fungus. So fortunately, we are given the name of the fungus. Now, that brings up another subject that I thought I'd mention, is that the nomenclature for fungi is changing. At one time, there was a completely different name assigned to the sexual stage versus the asexual stage. And I mean, they had a different genus name and a different species name compared to, you know, from these two different stages. It made it horrible for trying to learn anything about fungi. And the Europeans tended to favor one name versus the other, and the Americans like the other one. Well, it got really bad. And so recently, I think that they're moving towards just one name instead of two for fungi. And they're moving for whichever one is the oldest. So that's how they're deciding which one gets it, is the oldest one gets precedence.
And if you wanted to find fungi at the top of Mount Lemmon, what is the best season?
After the summer, when the summer rains are in full blast. So give a few days after the rains have been going really well up there. And I actually joined a Facebook group. I know Facebook is right now on a lot of people's bad list, but it does come in handy for some stuff. And I joined a group that kind of keeps me notified about what the weather systems are up there. And I try to keep track of what's been going on up there. And if it's been raining a lot up there, I try to pop on up. One thing I thought that I neglected to mention is that some slime molds are niviculous, which means that they love snow. And so some of them, and some of them are the most gorgeous things with beautiful, like peacock iridescent blue. And I would love to see these. They're called Lamproderma, and they're niviculous slime molds that will grow right at the edge of a snowbank. So this coming year, I'm going to try to get up to Mount Lemmon and look for some of those, where you'd have to look for like rotting wood or something right at the edge of the snow itself. And supposedly that's how you find those.
And then this is a more personal question. Do you have any photos of you on the ground taking these amazing pictures?
No, it would probably be mainly my butt sticking up and my head down near the ground, and you know, you just see this prostrate person, you know. And sometimes I have to lie on my back, like those Schizophilum commune, the ones I like so much that are such tough little fungi from the low desert. Those grow on dead trees that have like fallen over. So I had to like scoot on my back under this fallen tree that was leaning and literally squirm around. And I spent like 3 hours at a time in there. And each time I spent those 3 hours in that mesquite bosque during the summer monsoons, photographing slime molds and fungi, I came out looking like a red spotted toad because I was covered with chigger bites, mosquito bites, and sandfly bites. I mean, the chigger bites are all under your clothing, especially where it's tight, like your belt line. And then the mosquito bites were on my arms. And then the sandfly bites, like they love the tops of your ears and your forehead and stuff like that. So I was just a mass of insect bites. It was horrible. But you know, it's like I couldn't wait to go back out. It's so addictive. These little things are so much fun, and they're so cool to find. And they're like nothing else that you're ever gonna see. I mean, they're just so interesting, and the structures are so beautiful. So it's almost like it is very addictive, I'll be honest with you. You have to be careful about this stuff.
Well, there's several thank yous and wonderful presentation, beautiful. So thank you so much.
Well, I hope that people enjoyed it, and I'm just a real amateur. I'm struggling to learn this stuff myself. So if I can do it, anyone can do it. And even if you don't do focus stacking, you can still get decent photos. You know, I don't do focus stacking, and so my photos are really crummy compared to the people that work at it. But I get like 30 species in a day, whereas they might get 2, you know? So that's the difference. So depending on what you want to do, you know, I mean, if you want to put the effort into getting the perfect photo, you know, you can do the focus stacking of these little slime holes and get the perfect photo, or you can run around like I do and crawl around under the branches and stuff and get all these other fungi as well. But it's a lot of fun. It really is, despite all the bug bites. And Mount Lemon had no bug bites. I'll tell you that. That high elevation is heaven. You can spend all the time you want grubbing around on your knees, and it's just totally enjoyable. It's just really, really nice.
So, and Lynn, did you have anything to add?
No, I don't think so. I mean, your photos were amazing. It was really fun to see all the effort you'd put into it. And you're right. Fungi have amazing fruiting bodies that are sometimes tiny and absolutely delicate. It's hard to imagine how a hypha, you know, sort of a tubular hypha can get wrapped around itself and fabricated into these amazing tissues and these amazing shapes. But
it's living sculpture, and it's so ephemeral. So you have to, you know, that's partly what I think makes it so special is, you know, it's going to be gone so fast. And so you have to get out there and find it as quick as you can. It's really fun.
I think that the people who've seen your slides are certainly going to be more attuned to those little gems that are scattered throughout the habitats that we go to, even if they aren't going to crawl around and risk all the arthropod illnesses and injuries that you succumb to. At least they can observe them in real time and appreciate them as they're there. So that's a really nice way of helping us open our eyes to all the things that are out there for us to appreciate and enjoy. So
yeah, and I strongly urge people to bring a little hand lens and a light, because one of these little LED lights are like, they're very lightweight, they're very bright, and you can see stuff so much better with that. Especially in dim forest areas, like up on Mount Lemon, where it's very, you know, the burn areas are open, but the areas that didn't get burnt are fairly dim light sometimes, especially during monsoon season with a lot of clouds and thunder and hail.
Well, I guess I was wondering, do you do a lot of turning over litter in the forest or looking?
I do scrabble around a fair amount, and I'll look under dead wood, but I always try to put it back exactly the way I found it.
Right.
So it's really important to try to be a good citizen up there. Don't leave things looking torn apart.
Yeah, because other things besides the fungi live under rotting logs, and so if you leave it over, you're destroying the habitat for lots of other things. So if once you've seen it, put it back in place.
Right. Although I will say that professional mycologists have chastised me because I'm so reluctant to pick a mushroom to get those underside shots, you know, that they need that for identification. And I'll be like, oh, I hate to do that. You know, I don't want to destroy it. And they're like, look, that's the expendable part of it. You know, the mycorrhizae are the main part of the organism. It's sending up this fruiting body. It's expendable. It's like picking an apple from a tree is what they tell me. So they encourage me to go ahead and pick them, to photograph them, but I'm still very, very reluctant to do that. I just hate to destroy stuff. So.
Well, I mean, I think that's a meritorious kind of probably. Fungi are among the organisms that are the most resilient to disturbance of their fruiting bodies, because that's not really their body after all.
Right.
Most other things, you know, plants and insects and other things, when you collect them, you're collecting the reproductive structure and everything else. But
Right.
the vegetative nature of the hyphae, you know, you really are probably not doing much harm at all to the.
Yeah, so that makes me, you know, so next summer, if there's another good monsoon, I'm going to try to help the herbarium folks at the U of A and collect some specimens. One of the people there contacted me after I posted a few things on iNaturalist, and she said, I would love to get this for sequencing. I would love to get that for sequencing. And it's because a lot of the Southern Arizona stuff hasn't been really well pinned down and characterized as well as it should be. So, so some of it needs to be collected and sequenced. And if people are interested in that, I would strongly urge you to contact the herbarium and find out what the protocols are for collecting specimens so that you can contribute to their project of getting these fungi better characterized.
Okay, and then there's a question here that I missed, and then I think I see a hand up. Someone asked how long after the rains in the, well, it says the low country, I think they mean in the desert, before things show up. So how
Okay,
long?
well, I really, mainly you need a good soaking rain that's going to keep things wet for at least 24 hours, at least. And it's really better if it's one of these systems that keeps throwing a little moisture down for like several days in a row. But I would start checking it after any really good soaking rain, like an inch or even 3/4 of an inch, maybe go out and start taking a look around, you know, and if you get like 3 days of that, for sure, get out there, because there's going to be almost certainly stuff popping. By the time this stuff was, by the time I went out, there was literally slime molds on almost every dead leaf area you could look. I mean, they were everywhere. So once you become aware of these things, you'll start seeing them all over the place when the conditions are right. And there's quite a few different kinds. I found like 8 different slime molds on this one rotten tree that was in low desert that's normally dry as a bone, but during the monsoons, it had 8 different slime molds growing on it.
Yeah.
So it's really exciting sometimes.
And then, so there's someone, it says Dee's pad, if you'd like to unmute, do you have a question? I'm just seeing a yellow hand there. Well, maybe that's part of their decor.
I think that particular video hasn't had anyone in it for much.
Okay.
So that person is sitting somewhere else and listening. So,
Okay.
Oh, you know, and before we wrap up, I wanted to make a special thank you to Fred Heath and Sue Carnahan and John Schuring, because it was a discussion, an email discussion about ergot that made me go out and photograph those droplets of goo that the tanglehead grass was producing. So it's Fred Heath, Sue Carnahan, and John Schuring that all were talking about that stuff. And I went out and found some examples. So.
well, that's great. Thank you so much, Jillian. I think that brings our meeting to an end. Haven't been cut off by Zoom yet, but starting to vocalize again. So I probably go and see what his problem is. And it's great to see you all tonight. Thank you for coming. We'll meet again in November, and be sure to put on your calendar from the 8th to the 10th, the 2021 Botanical Symposium. Thank you so much, Jillian, for sharing all these great photos with us. We really appreciate it. Okay.
Thanks. Bye.
Everybody.
Good night.